Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Earthly Headlines. This time I came across an article titled 9,000-Year-Old Neolithic City Discovered in Jerusalem Valley. Apparently people were still transitioning from hunter-gathering to farming when this town that was discovered full of stone houses and a red plastered floor all around Jerusalem, and finally began to appreciate children. So I read this headline and I had to dig deep into it. The first thing I want to say about this article is that it's largely revolves around whether these people were hunter-gatherers or settled agricultural plant cultivators. It explains that they were in a transitionary period. But a lot of the details were kind of, I don't want to be nitpicky or anything, but some of the details didn't add up. And this is one of those articles where I really want to go paragraph by paragraph and analyze not every little bit. I'm not trying to split hairs or anything, but whatever is noteworthy to me, I want to talk about. And so I've kind of highlighted and dissected and changed I didn't change the language obviously, but I just sort of added some headings and stuff, and just to help, just as mental notes. So the first thing is where was this found, right? Jerusalem Valley, what does it look like? So here's a picture, and in the center where the brown mountainous region in the center of this image, and if you look to the west where the green is, that's the coast of the Mediterranean, and Jerusalem is further east inland. And this place, I think it's called Motza. They found it in this place called Motza, and it lies between this road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem called Highway 1 of Israel. The person who discovered it was Dr. Hamoudi Kalaili of the Israel Antiquities Authority. So the Antiquities Authority, if you don't know, they're kind of in charge of a lot of the excavations and a lot of the analysis of the countless stuff that they find. I mean, that area has been inhabited by people for a long time, and the stuff keeps coming in. So they have they have the Antiquities Authority in place for people like Dr. Kalaili. I think that's how you say his name, Kalaili. To investigate. So this Neolithic village dates back 9,000 years ago, or 7,000 BCE. Yes, discovered in Motza at the foot of the Jerusalem hills. It was discovered during the time when they were building a new road. Again, it was located in a highway connecting Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And in its heyday, it supported 1,000 people, which at the time, that's a city. That's actually not a huge city, but it's a modest sized city. It was about 500 meters in length, which isn't much smaller than a nearby village called Abu Ghosh, which is about the same size, I guess. It's a modern village. This place was mysteriously abandoned for about 400 years, or 5,000 years, when the Romans came and took over. So that's another big mystery, why this place suddenly disappeared after having such a long history of people living there. There was another discovered village called Schuster, also in Jerusalem, which dated to 7,000 years, and they had stone houses similar to the ones that they found in Motza. So the building blocks of the site. They found that the villagers made their stone bricks crudely using flint tools, and they used wooden stakes to jam into the cracks in order to break the natural rock, which is, I think, the natural rock of the mountain range near Jerusalem is limestone, which is, again, as far as hardness goes, limestone isn't that hard compared to other rocks. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The stone bricks were cemented with mud, which meant that every time it rained, they had to maintain it. So they had a system in place where they had repairs, and they knew the weather patterns well enough that they felt comfortable building their buildings out of the stuff that they chose. So it wasn't like a trial and error type of situation. This is kind of an established protocol that they had. And also the town was built at the confluence of two streams. Okay, so that makes even more sense. They had a water source. So again, they probably weren't just hunter-gatherers. They were probably more subsistence farmers, which brings us to this next section. Before that, let me show pictures of the actual excavation site. So here's the stone that they found. This looks like a foundation of some sort. And then here's the actual site, the excavation site. And I think that's the doctor. Kalaili. I think that's actually him with the gloves. All these volunteers over here, and here are the actual tools, which we'll get to in a second. So anyway, going back to whether they were hunter-gatherers or subsistence farmers. So the village builders 9,000 years ago were among the early adopters of a settled lifestyle. Though some stabs at cultivation clearly began in the Levant at least 3,000 years prior, it would take millennia before people transitioned more firmly from hunting and gathering to subsistence farming. Okay, so this struck me as an assumption right here. It would take millennia before people transitioned. I don't know. I think these are more of skills that were passed on from what they're saying, 23,000 plus years, because I don't think it takes 10,000 plus years to learn how to cultivate properly. Because remember, the distance between us and the time of Jesus is only 2,000 years. That's not that long. So if people were messing around with cultivation 23,000 years ago, this is 2100 BC. This is during the Pleistocene. This is during the height of the coldest portion of the part of the Ice Age. And again, we're talking about people like us, anatomically modern humans. These people would blend in with us if in a hypothetical situation. They could definitely blend in with us. I would have to assume that their capabilities with technology and techniques were probably the same as ours. I would be more willing to venture that instead of taking thousands and thousands of years of this transition between nomadic lifestyle and subsistence farming, I think there's probably just a lot of evidence that's disappeared and a lot of pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, that are just lost to obscurity that have yet to be found. And I can understand the conclusion they're coming to. This seems like a safe, albeit probably not really realistic in practice. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I'm not a scientist. It's just kind of a stream of consciousness thing. Okay. Anyway, the Motza site isn't the only huge settlement from that time. Dr. Kalaili from the Antiquities Authority told Haaretz, which is, by the way, this is an article, Haaretz. They published these findings. I couldn't find another actual scientific article where it goes over the actual techniques they use. I'm not sure if they radiocarbon dated this stuff or if they're just going by geological record or what. But I don't know how they came up with the dates. There are others, mainly in Jordan, but none have been thoroughly excavated. There are also some in Israel itself, including the once marshy Hula Valley. Okay, so he's saying that there's a lot of undiscovered, not thoroughly excavated sites that probably carry a lot of the missing pieces, or some missing pieces that I mentioned before. So Neolithic settlements were flourishing at the time. People who had passed the point of scrabbling subsistence from gathered grains and hunted rats, they had the leisure to build not only houses of stone, but public places featuring a more monumental type of construction, which the archaeologists found in this Motza site. Okay, leisure is a huge word here. It's like a trigger word. So they must not have been as much in transition as originally stated. In order to build monuments and stone houses, time away from hunting and gathering is necessary. Just like the doctor said, they must have had the leisure to do so. Leisure comes from not needing to hunt all day, period. So if they were living a life of leisure and they had an infrastructure in place that reflected that type of lifestyle that comes with leisure, then maybe they were already entrenched in. I don't see the transition that they keep talking about. Okay, let's talk about their role of religion. People seem to have long since discovered worship at this time. 12,000-year-old site Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, which is not that far. It's across the Mediterranean from Israel. and some call the world's first temple. So this type of religion in which monuments and structures were built for the express purpose of worship is far more of a hallmark of a settled culture than a wandering one. Again, wandering cultures don't have these, they don't go out of their way to build monuments worshiping a god or several gods. They're too busy. They gotta survive. They gotta follow weather patterns and stuff like that, and animal migrations. Kalili, for one, is comfortable speculating that specially invested edifices featuring specially invested flooring and tools serve some religious purpose that could have gone back a very long way. One thing about the site is there was red plastered flooring, and Kalili thinks it was served a religious purpose, which I don't know. I'm not well versed in that. Maybe they just liked red plaster on the floor, or maybe it did serve a religious purpose. But one thing for sure, we'll get to that. They discovered something under the plaster floor, so we'll get to that in a second. The fertile Motza Valley seems to have been occupied since the dawn of modern human existence. Again, there's that word, modern human existence. So are they talking about anatomically modern humans? They must not, because those go back 200,000 years. Were there people there 200,000 years ago? There might well have been. If this is a 200,000-year-old settlement, then I don't understand how that could be a transition. How does that even make sense? Are they walking back and forth up the Motza Valley? Is that what they mean? Anyway. I don't mean to be a dick about this. This Neolithic village is the largest nearby center of human activity in the area at its time. Does he mean humans in a structured civilization beyond nomadic hunting and hunter-gathering groups? So I think he should make a distinction here, because before 200,000 years is a long time to be in transition. So maybe there's some vagary there. I don't know. You guys tell me what you think in the comments. Maybe I'm off base. Maybe I had too much coffee this morning and I'm a little bit fired up. The next part of this article has to do with domestication of animals and plants. And there are a few things that I wanted to talk about here regarding that. So the first things first, he talks about transiting, again, in a subsistence base on hunting and gathering to farming. He says domestication of both plants and animals was very much still a work in progress. So the example they used was a hardy goat. Which, according to the article, it was domesticated 11,000 years ago, so about 2,000 years prior. 2,000 years is a long time to have a domesticated animal in place. I think that's a long time. He makes it sound like it's very short, but I don't know. Again, from Jesus to us, that's 2,000 years. I could see a few species of animals, not all of them, obviously, but the ones prone to domestication, like a goat or like a wolf or something like that, it could be domestic. I've seen them domesticate foxes in a few generations, so that doesn't seem like a big deal. The Motza goats were still a wild type bezoar, which once abounded in the region. So I guess the goats were in the thick of being domesticated. Once the wild baby goats identified people as mommy, they would be more amiable. I'm not sure about the validity of this claim, but I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than simply separating baby goats from the wild. I think there's probably a huge mechanism in domestication that a lot of people don't even know about. And perhaps the ancient people of this time were hip to something like that. They knew the pigs were domestic because their teeth and molars were in good condition, while wild boar teeth get ground down over time. That makes sense to me. Researchers also found evidence of domesticated, not wild type, wheat and barley, fava beans, and lentils. Fava had only been domesticated for 1,000 years by then, so it got about 10,000 years before, and they came from Galilee, 8,000 BC. So that, again, 1,000 years isn't that long of a time. That's still 1,000 years of having domesticated fava, and that's a long time for any society to be around. 1,000 years. America is only about a little like 240 years old, and that's considered super young. I don't want to get into that. I think they were pretty settled. They were settled in their way of eating domesticated fava back then, and that, to me, that's period, the end. Other settlements. They found another huge village, much bigger than they thought possible, on the shores of Galilee, which is a freshwater lake. So that does make sense. And it's dated to 12,000 years ago, same time as Göbekli Tepe, and it was a large freshwater lake settlement of people. Other settlements have been found at Atlit, A-T-L-I-T, an underwater site covering 10 acres. Okay, underwater is another trigger word. Says Dr. Jacob Vardy, who is directing the excavation at Motza together with Kalaili. There are other sites in Jordan and Turkey. So again, the pattern forming here is that there's a lot of discovered huge settlements and a lot of as yet heavily rumored settlements and as yet excavated settlements all over this area. So there's a lot of work still that needs to be done. And I don't want to read about any conclusions yet until a lot of these are at least studied for a little bit and explored. And it does seem like a lot was going on back then, since they keep discovering all kinds of settlements in this region during the time period. Perhaps these people were sophisticated enough to have records that go back further than ours do, and that an explanation or story that fills the gaps in our knowledge about them exists. If they were bright enough to have been domesticating plants and animals for almost 2,000 years or longer, then who knows what else they knew. They probably had all kinds of knowledge, including pottery, which I'll get to that in a second. Their outlook on children, I thought this was this is pretty interesting. It was pretty compelling, actually. And again, the plaster floors that I mentioned earlier, underneath they found 10 people were found buried, lying in fetal positions. Some were men, some were women, and some were children and little babies. And according to Kalaili, this was the first known time in human history children were considered something other than disposable. That's a big statement, and I don't know if that's true or not, but Dr. Kalaili thinks so. During the transitional time between hunting and gathering and settlement, the attitude toward children in life and death changed, she explains. No earlier burials of children have been found. If a baby died, they didn't consider it important or bury it, or at least there is no sign that they did. But after people settled, they began burying babies. And that does make sense to me. His explanation here does make some sense, because it follows that the community's attitude toward children would change once the population settled in one area. It makes sense that they would start planning ahead for the future and recognize that the cultivation of the future generations to carry on life in their settlements would be paramount to their long-term survival. Hunter-gatherers probably do not share that same perspective, probably because the context of their day-to-day living situations wouldn't provide them the sense of urgency to spend the time to raise kids in that way. They definitely valued children, but their utilitarian way of living required the children to adapt largely on their own merits, and as they say, only the strong survive. People living in settlements had the time and space to spend resources and energy on upbringing instead of bringing children along for the ride of a nomadic lifestyle. Hunter-gatherers had to constantly live in the moment and make moves based on forces of nature, like weather patterns and animal migrations, and the children worth having around were the ones who could survive and stick around to adulthood, which explains why the hunter-gatherers didn't have burials for them when they were too weak and died. I've heard all that by other anthropologists who studied even modern day hunter-gatherers, the ones that are still around today. And they had the same outlook. They didn't have, their perspective is much different from, when I say they, I mean hunter-gatherer's perspective is much different than a person who's settled. A person who's settled can be forward-thinking. They can plan way further ahead than a hunter-gatherer can. The hunter-gatherer is living day to day. The person with the family living at home is thinking about the next cycle, the next crop cycle, other people in the community, their children and their future. So this makes a lot of sense. That Dr. Kalaili actually made some sense here. Some of the bodies lack skulls. This is kind of a mystery that I don't know how you could explain, but the doctor tries to explain it. The skulls were gone and they were covered in clay and used as ritual objects. At least that's what the archaeologists suspect. Plastered skulls 9,500 years old have been found all over the region, from southern Israel to Turkey, including Göbekli Tepe. I didn't know Göbekli Tepe. I didn't know there were skulls at Göbekli Tepe, but I guess there were. Some believe the skulls attest to an absolutely vast ancestor cult that contributed to the successful rise of complex societies in the Neolithic. Okay, this is interesting. This reminds me of magicians of the gods again. A vast ancestor cult that contributed to the successful rise of complex societies in the Neolithic. What could they have worshipped? What kind of skills and techniques did they have for living on Earth to continue their worship? Was this Oannes? Were these the civilizing figures described in the Sumerian texts and among others? That's what I thought. This is all speculation, but they might be onto something there. Kalaili says when a leader died, they would bury him, and after some years, after the body decayed, they would remove the skull and turn it into a mask. The skull would be fleshed out using plaster and was probably repainted to depict the deceased. If he was good, he would have open eyes, and if he was bad, the eyes would show it. Kalaili speculates. The skull would then be placed in a public place as a guide for the younger generation of leaders. This is an interesting theory, but I would like to know if those decorative and ritualistic skulls were tested and proved to belong to the headless remains that people found underneath the homes in Motza. If those were the same people and they dated to the same time, then I would be a little bit... But until then, it's still an interesting thought. I'm not saying that he's wrong. I would just like to be a little bit cautious. Because again, they say the plaster skulls were 9,500 years old. That's about 1,500 years too old, if what they say about Motza is true and it dates back 9,000 years or 7,000 BC. Why leaders are necessary? Dr. Vardy has another theory for why they're necessary. In a group of wanderers, tensions would have broken up the group. Once you settle down, you're stuck with objects which can't be moved, like real estate. Tensions then arise, and squabbles over land and property happen. And you need someone to manage the conflicts, which I guess that makes sense. It does make sense. Or it could be maybe the chief was someone who had skills. Again, I hate to go back to, I don't hate to go back to magicians of the gods, but Göbekli Tepe and all those people they worshipped, maybe they were real people, and maybe they were people with skills who rounded up everyone who didn't have the skills and decided to teach them. And maybe they assumed the role of leaders, or at least elders. But then again, maybe they didn't. Maybe there were separate chiefs who made decisions specifically over real estate. Food for thought. What the archaeologists didn't find is pottery. This was a pre-pottery Neolithic culture. Okay, it is like that now, but I don't know. I just feel like they haven't found it yet. Maybe it's still out there. Again, like I said, there's so many different settlements that they haven't even found. I wouldn't get ahead of myself and declare that this was pre-pottery, because they had stone blades, arrowheads, spearheads, axe heads. They were cultivating plants. I mean, pottery has been around. I guess the oldest pottery ever dates back 20,000 years ago in southern China. Okay, 20,000 years ago in southern China. And plant cultivation, the earliest evidence of that is about around the same time, 23,000 years ago. And not only that, in Egypt around 8,000 BC they were making glass, and Egypt is right there. It's not that far from this site. So maybe they haven't survived. Maybe they just haven't found them. Maybe a lot of them were destroyed for some cultural reason. But I wouldn't assume that they're all gone. And by the way, this photo right here are some of the tools that they found, and they look in remarkable shape. This is a very interesting photo. I like this photo. These are clearly, this is a spearhead right here. The thing on the top left looks like a handle, and so on. And then vanished. 8,700 years ago, or 6,700 BC, the village was abandoned. They don't know what happened. Maybe there was an epidemic. Maybe the resources ran out, which I find super hard to believe. And then, out of nowhere, the Romans revived this place around 200 BC. So maybe there was some literature back then. Maybe there was some talk, or maybe there was some knowledge floating around about this place. And the Romans got wind of it and thought, okay, this place is significant enough for us to come and look for it. And not only look for it, build a new city, a new settlement. I don't know. I thought that's very interesting. This discovery, although I don't agree, or I'm more cautious than some of the doctors involved, such as Dr. Kalaili. It's still there. It still exists. It's still 9,000 years old or older. It might have been built there even further back. But the fact is that this place exists, just like Göbekli Tepe. You can squabble over the details about Göbekli Tepe all you want, but the fact is that it exists. It's there now. We know about it. What's left to do except do more excavations and try to gather more data and really see what we're dealing with here? And I think this is a very beneficial article for science, and I think it's going to go a long way, especially if you couple some of the discoveries made here, like the children in the bodies under the plaster floor. Maybe we'll get some answers if we excavate other places. What do you guys think? Please let me know in the comments. I recently started uploading stuff to Bitchute, so check out the Bitchute as well if you don't want to go to YouTube. And send me a tweet. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate each and every one of you. And I'll stay tuned for tomorrow.